Well, it's 6:05, so I think probably about time to get started. My name is Rafy Hay, and thank you all for joining us at this Pushkin House talk in collaboration with the Anglo-Russian Research Network. Tonight, it's the fourth of our 6 talks, and today Dr. Cathy McAteer will be presenting on the Penguin Russian Classics series. Cathy is a postdoctoral fellow on the Dark Side of Translation project at Rustrans, affiliated with the University of Exeter. Her main research interests lie in the field of classic Russian literature and English translation during the 20th century, using archival material to shed new light on the people and processes behind historical commissions, specifically Penguin's Russian Classics. And her monograph on this subject, Translating Great Russian Literature, the Penguin Russian Classics series, is coming from Routledge later this year. We're very grateful to the Anglo-Russian Research Network for helping organize these. It's been a really interesting and useful series that we've had running here, and they are a kind of academic group that is based in Exeter and mostly works on, as the name suggests, the kind of cultural collaboration between Britain or the Anglosphere and Russia. And they are, I think, looking for submissions for book group ideas and seminars. So the details for submitting are on our on the event pages for these talks. So I won't take up too much time more. So I'll hand over to Cathy. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rafy. What I'm going to just do to start with is share my screen. And okay, right. So yes, hello and good evening. And thank you so very much for tuning in, zooming in on a Friday evening to watch my contribution this week to the ongoing and excellent Anglo-Russian Research Network series of seminars at Pushkin House. As Rafy said, I'm the 4th in the series. There are 2 more yet to come. That should take you nicely up to Christmas. And I know, judging by Twitter's response to the talks we've had so far, they've been really well received and people have found them very interesting. So I hope that the same will happen tonight and that you'll find it interesting too. And yes, as Rafy said, I'm going to be talking about translating great Russian literature, the Penguin Russian Classics. If you have gone to the trouble of scanning Pushkin House events, booking yourself onto this evening's event and actually taking the trouble to tune in on a Friday night, then I hope it's because it could be because of a reason for loving Penguin books, loving Russian literature, putting the 2 together, loving Penguin Russian Classics, having a love of book history and or translation. So any of the above, literary translation. I'm hoping that if it's the Penguin Russian Classics line of interest, then it's perhaps because it was one of your first initiations in all things Russian, because it certainly was for me. It's possible that these books featured on a university reading list. In all likelihood, they probably appeared on that list in the original. You are expected to read the Russian. However, as a Russian undergraduate and time being what it is as a student, you probably all reached for a Penguin Russian Classic, just to speed things up a little bit. Tolstoy is very large and time is very short. So either way, these might be the books that got you hooked on characters who will follow you around for a lifetime. The Raskolnikovs, the Anna Kareninas, the Pierre Bezukhov, Oblomov, Prince Myshkin, Yevgeny Onegin, or perhaps especially the rascally Chichikov, as it is for me. I like Chichikov. So if this is the case, then you can probably picture the familiar front covers. They either look like this, the original type, or they look like this, the later black cover series. And this, in fact, is my first ever Penguin Russian Classic. This is Gogol's Diary of a Madman, bought back in the days, believe it or not, when you actually got 5p change from a £3 book voucher. So that's going to age me immediately, but nevertheless, that's the truth. Now, dignified initially by their red colour code, So this is the red border that you see, red border, a creamy white background, a roundel on the front cover, complete with a text-specific black and white illustration, and a collectible number on the spine, collectible in that we all want to have a complete set. So penguin, so a number on the side, on the spine, so that everybody would go and have that complete set, keep buying them. But these were Penguin's recognizable Russian classics. They represent the main relaunch of the classic Russian literary canon in English in the mid-20th century. So my doctoral research focused predominantly on the Penguin Classics Medallion series. That's the series with the roundel on the front cover. There were 16 classic Russian titles, which Penguin published between 1950 and 1964 in a brand new modern cadence and in an affordable, accessible format. I'll talk in a little more detail about that in a moment. But thanks to my role in the Rustrans project, which is hosted at Exeter, I've also been able to extend my archival research to include publications up to the mid-1980s. They sort of peter out there because the archival material peters out there. Things move over to telephone, telex, perhaps even computer by that stage. So archival material becomes scant. But that's the era that includes translations of the lesser known 19th century classics, retranslations of those medallion classics, it's on full circle, time to do them again, and also the arrival of Soviet dissident literature. So in case you are wondering how it started as an interest, my interest into the how, why, who, and when of these translation commissions surfaced during my MA in Translation Studies. When I started doing this some literary translation, and that's when I began to really consider the people and the processes behind the series, which had formed my own enduring appreciation of Russian literature. My PhD used primary archival material to construct a microhistory of Penguin's translators with which to try and answer those questions. And at times, this was easier said than done. I mean, it's much harder now because we're in lockdown or about to come out, but the archives have been closed. But even before that, it was a case of scrabbling around and trying to collate information from all different places. So from interviews, from the books themselves, certainly leafing through the paratextual material, and from a number of different repositories. So those key sites for my research were the Penguin Archive. Believe it or not, there's 5 kilometres worth of archive housed at the University of Bristol. What I probably ought to stress at this point is that the Penguin Russian translations form a comparatively tiny section of that 5 kilometres. So bear that in mind. There's also the Leeds Russian Archive at Leeds University and the CEAS Archive at UCL. So before I introduce the translators themselves, who I suspect will now probably also follow me around like the characters in the novels they translated, I'd just like to spend a moment or two to rewind just a fraction and set the scene. I'd like to introduce other figures who were instrumental in Penguin's relaunch of the classic Russian literary canon after Constance Garnett's 50-year reign. So the first person to introduce is this gentleman. This is Sir Alan Lane. He's the founder, the patron of Penguin Books. He's the gentleman who pledged his economic capital, his risk and innovation to fund, publish, promote and sell his portable paperbacks. They were modern looking, they were eye-catching, and they all had that memorable logo. So for Lane, accessibility on all levels was key. He took away as many barriers as possible to enable the Anglophone every man, woman and child to enjoy a good book, but in this particular case, a good Russian book. And Penguins were accessible not just in terms of their retail outlets, so you could buy a Penguin book at railway stations, in bookshops, and also in the absolutely charmingly named Penguincubator vending machine. This is not the first place to have a vending machine for books, but it was the first to be called something as lovely as the Penguincubator. The books were accessible in terms of size. They were pocket-sized. No matter what job you were doing, if you were out and about, if you were a soldier, it would fit in your pocket, very important. But in terms of cost as well. So the books were pitched at the price of a packet of cigarettes. So quite accessible, therefore. They were also accessible in terms of content, the language. It was felt that they must appeal to, not patronize, a mass lay audience. This audience being the new wave of the post-war, self-educating, self-improving British working class. So Lane launched his Penguin books in 1935, and not long after, by the late 1930s, as the archive reveals, he entered into discussion with two emigre Russians. The first was Samuel Kotylyansky, the translator, a friend to D.H. Lawrence, Catherine Mansfield, and Virginia Woolf. And the other was Sergei Konovalov. He's the New College, Oxford professor of Russian language and literature. And he entered into discussion with them about the prospect of publishing translations of Russian literature. Kotylyansky oversaw Penguin's earliest edition of Chekhov plays, and then the Russian short stories that were published in 1940 and 1941, respectively. And Konovalov helped by recommending translators and ideas for a follow-up anthology of Soviet short stories. Now, both Kotylyansky and Konovalov, independently of each other, alluded to a popular interest in and the saleability of Russian literature at that time. So in a letter in April 1941, Kotylyansky noted quite optimistically that his Russian short stories should sell very well at present. And then later, in a letter dated 20th of November 1945, Konovalov told Lane, "We would all welcome a further selection of stories covering the Soviet period." So we can see from the correspondence that Lane was certainly not averse to featuring Russian literature in his publications early on. One could think that this was coincidental, just a mere dipping his toe in the water, but for the Penguin periodical, which we see here. This is the Penguin Russian Review, and this was issued amid post-war euphoria. The existence of this very slim journal, you perhaps can't tell there, it does look slim, but there are approximately 130 pages in each copy. It not only confirms Lane's more than passing interest in things Russian, but also helps in aiding our understanding of how Penguin's Russian classics later came into being. The 4 issues were produced in total starting in September 1945, with the last one appearing in 1948. Each issue of, as I say, roughly 130 pages or so of very close spaced text contained articles specifically relating to Russia and the USSR, including Soviet economics, Soviet literature, geography, art, history, and agriculture. The contributors included Russophiles and specialists, some of them well known and some of them with pro-Soviet associations. Amongst them were, for example, Count Connie Benkendorf, Colonel Edward Crankshaw, George Revie, and perhaps most famously of all, Sir Robert Bruce Lockhart. Now, Penguin's aim is set out very clearly, albeit anonymously, in the second edition of the Russian Review in March 1946. And it was namely to counter Russophobic sentiment with high culture. So what was written in that particular editorial, I'm going to say it in full, but some of it's on the slide. The purpose of this review, which dedicates itself to the general reader, is nothing less than to contribute to the initiation of the stranger to Russia into the spirit of the Russian people, as it is embodied in their history and literature, their arts and sciences, their philosophy, their aspiration, and their economic life. We believe that one of the greatest impediments to a true understanding of Russia's aims and problems has been an oversimplification of the complex nature of her attainments and the innumerable cross-currents of her life and thought. In this review, we shall seek to combat this tendency by bringing together articles and essays on the multitudinous aspects of Russian life, and by allowing Russia herself to speak through her imaginative writers and poets. Great. It seems, however, that the general British reader had other plans. This all sounds marvelous to me as somebody who loves Russian literature and everything to do with Russia, but the general British reader was not interested. They did not buy the review. The booksellers ended up returning countless unsold copies to Penguin. At least 4,000 were returned to Penguin. And by the fourth edition, published just 5 months before the Berlin airlift, Penguin, or rather Lane, had to admit that growing pessimism over the state of Anglo-Russian relations had impacted directly on sales, thus rendering the venture unviable. So unfortunately, the periodical was discontinued. However, the review's aspiration to combat the oversimplification of Russia's complex nature through literature found a new outlet for expression in a parallel Penguin venture, which was obviously the Penguin Classics. This is the formidable founding father of the Penguin Classics series himself. This is Evie Rier, and he articulated the same sentiment as the review when he said that texts chosen for his series help us to appreciate and understand the essential differences that divide us as much as the universal truths that bind us together. Their value is incalculable, and their loss or destruction would diminish us all. Now, Emil Victor Rier was key to the entire Penguin Classics series. His translation of Homer's Odyssey launched the Penguin Classics in 1946, and it came with a mission statement to produce readable, attractive versions of great writers' books in good modern English. And this statement would influence the entire Medallion series and the manner in which Russian literature would be brought to the modern audience. So Rier placed the onus of producing readable versions in good modern English on the translators he commissioned. He maintained that it is the translator's job to make the text explain itself, remembering always that it is not erudition that we want to teach, but appreciation. He famously invited Oxbridge dons first to try their hand at translating texts for him, but Rier rejected their sample translations on the grounds that very few of them could write decent English, and most were enslaved by the idiom of the original language. Rier consciously strove, therefore, to break from the idea of translation by scholars for scholars. He gravitated instead towards translators who showed an intuitive translational talent and a feel for writing. In the July 1946 edition of Penguin's Progress, this was a sort of a publicity pamphlet that was sent out to 50,000 readers for free. The first issue to appear after a 6-year war break, that's July 1946. In that particular issue, Rier proposed an invitation. He said, translations are being sought out for many other volumes covering a wide variety of literature, ranging from the literature of ancient Egypt to the closing years of the 19th century. So that's his invitation to translators to just send stuff in. So what I'd like to do now is move our focus to the non-scholars themselves who fulfilled this particular remit, the translators, who were commissioned for their linguistic, cultural, and literary capital. Penguin's online A to Z of first edition's translators admits translators are very much a hidden group of people. We think of the title of the book and the author. We may remember the image of the front cover, but the person who transformed the novel, poem, or non-fiction book from another language into English and made it a delight to read is often overlooked. So if you attempt to glean any background information about the early Russian translators, a blank is drawn nearly every time. So yes, they're very hidden indeed. These men and women have the briefest public biographies, if any, and in nearly all cases, there is little mention of how editor and translator forged the relationship in the first place. By all accounts, it would appear to have been over a glass of wine and actually over a long dinner in Soho, but there we go. Thankfully, the archives have helped to piece together a snapshot of personalities and an insight into the working relationships and the commercial decisions at Penguin. So these 4 translators are the ones that I would like to talk about. They're of particular interest as they arrive when Penguin's Russian classics are just getting underway. It's an exciting time. They are Gilbert Gardiner, Yelizaveta Fenn, David Magarshack, and Rosemary Edmonds. Since the era of vocational training in literary translation had not yet arrived, anyone with knowledge of translation theory would have been self-taught. Penguin's early Russian classics translators might have acquired and used their language skills in different settings, both professional and personal, but without exception, their backgrounds reflect the lived experience of a Europe in transition. Fenn and Magarshack immigrated to the UK from turbulent post-revolutionary Russia. Edmonds had worked as a senior wartime translator. Translators who came later, Paul Foote, for example, studied Russian on the Inter-Service Joint Services School of Linguists, the JSSL course at Cambridge, before working as an interpreter in Potsdam in 1946. Joshua Cooper also attended the JSSL, and Richard Freeborn, a translator of Turgenev, he worked in the RAF and post-war Potsdam before finally moving to the British Embassy in Moscow. So with background details such as these, it's not surprising that these individuals eventually found work which transposed their language skills to the field of translation in peacetime Britain. And where better to do this than Penguin Classics, the publisher of the moment. So I'd like to begin with Gilbert Gardiner. He is the very first Russian translator to be commissioned and published by Penguin. He was the translator of Turgenev's On the Eve, which was published in 1950. To all intents and purposes, his commission is a model one. To say that it is the very first Russian classic commission to reach completion, Gardiner's file is surprisingly thin. It is disappointingly threadbare. He appears to have been entirely satisfied with his terms and conditions. The Penguin editors were pleased with the translation itself, and its transition from manuscript to shelf was very straightforward. And yet, when you actually arrive at the very end of the file, there is a surprise element to this model commission, and it comes in the form of a letter that Gardiner wrote to Penguin on the 21st of April, 1976. So that's 26 years after the initial release of his translation. And in that letter, he states that he's actually missed his royalties for the entire period since 1951. So with 40,000 copies sold during that time, Gardiner was actually owed a sizable £633.48, and in current money that equates to £3,983.64. So Gardiner's polite wait of 26 years suggests two things: that he's in no urgent need of these finances and translation is probably not his sole means of income. And secondly, that Penguin's accounts are in no rush to dispatch royalties unless directly asked for them. And that was by no means the only such instance. Agatha Christie is perhaps a more famous person who had to keep badgering Alan Lane for her royalties too. It apparently provoked a mischievous glint in Alan Lane's eye. Now, the next translator to discuss is this also rather formidable looking person. This is Yelizaveta Fenn, or otherwise known as Lydia Vitalyevna Zhiburtovich, and her dates are 1899 to 1983. She was in fact Belarusian born, and she studied Russian language and literature at Leningrad University before coming to Britain in 1925. She became Lydia Jackson after marrying a British citizen in 1929. By training and by qualification, she was a child psychologist, and she actually also had the love of literature, and she adopted the pen name Yelizaveta Fenn whenever she was writing her novels and biographies and translating Russian literature into English. So archived correspondence demonstrates that Fenn was acquainted with Ria in an advisory capacity at an early stage in the Penguin Classics journey. It might have been through Oxford links, it might have been through Methuen links, but they were acquainted early on. Ria consulted her on a number of things, such as the quality of sample translations. So Rosemary Edmonds, the Tolstoy translator, she actually submitted 2 sample translations. They were undecided about her talents, and so Fenn suggested that she do a few more sample translations. Ria asked Fenn's advice about which authors and titles Penguin might commission for translation. That said, her suggestion that Penguin really might like to offer readers Zoshenka was not taken up. And I suspect the decision was influenced by Koteliansky's verdict at around the same time, where he said, there are more worthwhile Russian writers than Zoshenka to be published by you. So clearly they went for Koteliansky's verdict and not Fenn's. It was Fenn who also acted as a go-between for her friend Gilbert Gardiner and Evie Ria. Now, although Fenn translated other Russian authors for other publishing houses, she translated only Chekhov plays for Penguin, with publications in 1951, 54, and 59. And to her great disappointment, Ria would not let her try her hand at other translations, even though she expressly asked for a commission to translate some of Chekhov's stories. Now, Ria explained more than once, there are multiple letters, very polite, all of them, but he explained that she had not fully captured the English idiom in her sample work, even though she'd gone to the trouble of consulting English native speakers. So it was a sad realization for her that she wasn't going to go beyond Chekhov's plays. And it's safest to say that her biggest contribution to the Penguin Classics enterprise was the consultative role that she performed in support of Ria in the early years. Next, we have Rosemary Edmonds. Her dates are 1905 to 1998. She originally worked as a translator to General de Gaulle at the Fighting France headquarters in London and on Liberation in Paris. After the war, Edmonds announced her desire to learn Russian at the Sorbonne, and de Gaulle was very reluctant to let her go. He really liked working with her. Eventually, however, he agreed and actually paid for Edmonds' Russian lessons at the Sorbonne. Once she'd completed that, it seems she was then recruited by Ria. We do not know how, but she was recruited to translate works by Tolstoy, starting with Anna Karenina in 1954, and then War and Peace in 1957. And that was the point that she actually traveled to Russia for the very first time. She'd already got some commissions under her belt before she even visited Russia, rather Garnet-esque actually. She translated The Cossacks in 1960, Childhood, Boyhood, Youth in 1964, Resurrection in 1966, but also threw into the mix Pushkin, The Queen of Spades, and Turgenev's Fathers and Sons. Now, on evaluating Edmonds' very first typescript, that of Anna Karenina, Evie Ria remarked that, "I have examined the text carefully and found it good, though I do not think she is one of our A+ translators. I have also read the introduction, which is, in my opinion, a bit feeble, but not altogether rotten." How to be damned by faint praise. Edmonds elicited an altogether more positive response from the editors in her decision to use the anglicized form Anna Karenina, not Karenina. Her approach was applauded by Ria's co-editor, Alan Samuel Bates Glover, ASB Glover, who noted that the English press would call Stalin's wife Madame Stalin and not Madame Stalina. So there you go, that's the reason why. The biggest tension for Edmonds throughout her Penguin career arose from unauthorized changes to her text. There were spelling changes, punctuation changes, and even deletions. And she absolutely coveted quite proudly her text-based decisions. She didn't argue about anything else, but she finally demanded written confirmation that her work should never again be tampered with without her consent. And a clause to that effect was eventually written into her contract in February 1966. Her tenure, unfortunately, concluded at Penguin later that same year. And that was when there were new editors, Robert Baldick, who was himself a translator. He translated Flaubert for Penguin, and James Cochrane. These were brand new as editors there. They both concurred, unfortunately, that the quality of her translation had fallen below the required standard. They were checking her typescript for the Kreutzer Sonata, and they both concluded that it couldn't just be Tolstoy who was so stiff and stilted. So unfortunately, her commissions ended, but that's not the end of Edmonds' story. She went from Penguin to learn Old Church Slavonic. She became a translator of Russian Orthodox religious texts. Apparently, no seeker of public recognition, Edmonds was awarded the Freedom of the City of London in March 1979. But it's the endurance of her translations which best contests Ria's early view that she was not an A+ translator. Penguin published a new translation of Anna Karenina only as recently as 2000, 46 years after Edmund's version, and her 1958-1962 translation of Pushkin's The Queen of Spades is still being used by Penguin, reprinted in 1968, 78, and as an ebook in 2004. So now I would like to move on to David Magarshack, who formed a key point of study for my doctoral research. He serves for me as a bridge between the Garnet era of translation and the translations which have come since the Penguin medallion and black cover era. Magarshack's Penguin career spanned a similar length of time to Edmund's of 15 years, and he had 7 publications. You can see them here. There's Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, The Devils, and Brothers Karamazov. There's Gogol's Dead Souls, Goncharov's Oblomov, and Chekhov's Lady with Lapdog. It is, however, primarily his Penguin translations of Dostoevsky for which he's best remembered. In spite of his novels, translations, and biographies, there were a staggering 44 published works in total. When Magarshack died in October 1977, his obituary in the Times made no mention of any translation work at all and hailed only his work as a biographer. So it seems a remarkable oversight. So this is him, this is David Magarshack. I can tell you that he was born in Riga, then Russia, in 1899. He emigrated in 1919, and his reasons were to escape anti-Semitic education legislation, which had been imposed. There was a cap on the number of Jews eligible for higher education, and that's exactly what he wanted. So he left behind his parents. They cut him off entirely, his sisters, who then emigrated themselves to Israel, and he arrived in the UK with scarcely any English. So it's quite impressive that he graduated just 4 years later from the University of London with a 2-1 in English language and literature. And from there, he went to work at Fleet Street as a journalist. He became a British citizen in 1931, unlike many Russian emigres from that wave who wanted to keep the route back to Russia alive. He decided to just put his lot in with the UK. He married the Yorkshire-born, working-class, Cambridge graduate of English, Elsie, with whom he had 4 children. And Magarshack apparently loved English, England, the pub, English beer, and he never returned to Russia. His children never learned Russian. He apparently never spoke it at home. You could say he became a чисто английский gentleman, a perfect English gent. So at first, Magarshack fancied himself a novelist, and he wrote crime novels. He wrote 3, which were published in English in the 1930s. If you feel so inclined to read them, you can request them from the British Library. Some were endorsed by the British crime writer and, in fact, fellow Penguin translator Dorothy L. Sayers, and pretty much all of them reveal his classic Russian roots. And this is namely in his references to Dostoevsky, not specifically by name, but everywhere in the content. So there are societal Napoleons, there's overdue rent, there's murder, and there are Porphyry-style detectives running throughout his crime novels. So it must have come as a great disappointment, therefore, that he failed to reach Dostoevsky's crime writing success here in the UK. He spent years trying to carve a niche for himself as a wordsmith and to be gainfully employed. In need of an income, he wrote to the Manchester Guardian in late 1928, seeking journalistic or editorial work, anything that was going really. And he stated that he would be glad of anything at present, for I am rather in a tight corner. He was finally forced to turn to translation after the war, much to Elsie's relief, apparently, and to Elsie's parents' relief too, who apparently always referred disdainfully to Magarshack as the foreigner. And they were not happy that he wasn't bringing enough money in. And Magarshack's most auspicious move was to respond to that call by Ria in 1946 for further translations, which might suit the burgeoning Penguin Classics series. And his timing was perfect. Ria and Magarshack entered into discussion just as Penguin's first commission for a translation of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment by Frank Friedeberg Seeley had been abruptly terminated. It was in fact commissioned in 1946. It would have been the very first Penguin Russian classic, but it took a year to obtain a source text from Russia. And then there were 2 further wasted years and a terminated contract. So Penguin was left with a bit of a headache, and much to their relief, Magarshack turned up on the scene with some literary aspirin, if you like. His speedy replacement manuscript, which was in fact submitted months before the agreed deadline, heralded the start of Magarshack's relationship with Penguin, and specifically with the editors Ria and Glover, whose timings at Penguin overlapped with Magarshack's. So Glover resigned in 1958 and Ria retired in 1964, the same year as Magarshack's last Penguin translation. So he had a good run of working for Penguin. Ria and Magarshack overlapped on matters other than timings too. They shared the same vision of making literature accessible to a wide audience that would be achieved through what is called the principle of equivalent effect. Now that was a phrase that was coined by Ria, and it was then soon adopted by the translation scholar Eugene Nida. He does credit Ria with coining that phrase. In the 1954 interview translating the Gospels, Ria called this principle the lodestar of the translator's art, adding that the best translation comes nearest to giving its modern audience the same effect as the original first had on its audiences. In a nutshell, this is the definition of the principle of equivalent effect. But in reality, Magarshack needed a bit of help with that equivalent effect, help which came in the form of his wife, Elsie. She is the unsung, unknown agent behind Magarshack's success. As a relative newcomer to English, Magarshack relied on her to proofread and correct all his commissions, and it was something which she did apparently with great enthusiasm, but no recognition. Magarshack never mentioned in his paratexts or his interviews this close collaboration with his wife, and she was happy apparently just to have money coming in. As Magarshack's daughter herself told me during our interview, without Elsie's help, my father would have been helpless. So Magarshack's attempts at achieving textual appreciation rather than erudition manifest themselves in a variety of ways in his novels. And these examples that I'm going to give in a moment are taken from The Idiot, published by Penguin in 1955, but really they are representative of Magarshack's translation techniques generally. So what I'd like to do is present you with a typical 19th century Russian ball, a pre-revolutionary Russian ball scene. And I'm going to add some layers of Magarshack effects, and we'll see how it affects the authenticity of the original scene. So you have to imagine these are having a wonderful, lavish Russian spoken time. It's going to be a visual metaphor, if you like, for Magarshack's translation practice, because what he did, for starters, was use British Anglicisms. So he used words such as pub, smelling salts instead of alcohol. And there are also some very British flavoured terms like rowdy fellow, a buffoon, my dear sir, and hark do you hear. So superimposing those onto what was a pre-revolutionary Russian scene, it suddenly starts to change things slightly. He neutralized a good number of culture-specific references, both from the French and the Russian, for the benefit of his general Anglophone reader. So bouillon becomes strong hot soup, and petit jeu is translated into parlor games. And even mummy, which would be understood, even mummy is used instead of maman, which would be understood by everybody. The Russian realia are also shorn of some of their foreignness too. They are often paraphrased. They're occasionally repackaged for the reader into more accessible or recognizable forms. So, for example, the distinctly Russian oladyi, as they appear in the source text, osobych oladyi, they become special fritters. If we were going to anglicize them even more, probably soured cream drop scones would be more accurate still, but there you go. Kotlety become cutlets. But this is post-war Britain, so probably it would be better translated as rissoles. And early on in The Idiot, Prince Myshkin's companion, the dastardly Rogozhin, describes a world of tarred boots, and all we have for dinner is thin cabbage soup. And Magarshack transports the Russian-style sapagi to these normal British work boots, hard boots, and the frugal Lenten shi to a dish much more reminiscent of Dickens's workhouses than Russian Orthodox peasant life. Like Edmonds, there is another effect he used, and this is anglicizing character names. He used Mr., Mrs., and Miss He felt that this very much matched naming etiquettes in Russian, and he significantly reduced the frequency of patronymics. In Magarshack's own words, the translator's ultimate aim is to avoid uncertainty or confusion in the target reader. And you only have to scan through Goodreads or various popular reviews to read that naming in Russian is a big obstacle to a lot of readers. They are not comfortable. If they're not initiated in the Russian language, it slows things down. Magarshack also strove to domesticate dialogue in a way which Garnett famously did not attempt. He attempted to impart some idiomatic Englishness to Dostoevsky's characters. What emerges, though, is often a bit of a speech hybrid with elements of a Dickensian Dostoevsky, switching between the correct register of classic literature and the inflections associated with a London barfly, to quote Rachel May, who's the author of the translator in this text. Now, though efficient and speedy and supported by his wife, Magarshack was not the easiest freelancer for Ria and Glover to manage. And this is where social interactions come to the fore in the archive. He very much relied on translation for his income. He was not a hobbyist. There is an assertiveness in his letters, particularly over money matters, unlike Gilbert Gardiner's letters. If we remember, Gilbert Gardiner waited 26 years for his money. That is not Magarshack's approach. He had a family to support. He needed to pay bills. He often talks about bills in his letters. He needed his money. So by 1964, a combination of persistence, dogged assertiveness, as well as creeping question marks over the quality of some of Magarshack's work, ultimately caused him to, quote, fall out of favor, end quote, at Penguin. His translation of Chekhov's stories, Lady with Lapdog, marks the end of his career at Penguin. That, however, is not the end of his whole career. He continued to translate for other publishers. He wrote his Pushkin biography, and in 1968, he embarked on a brand new route, one which most people are unaware he ever took, and that was into translation theory. For those of you who might decide to consult my book when it does come out very soon, there are more details in there. I expand rather more about this particular chapter in Magarshack's life in there. But suffice to say for now that he was commissioned to produce effectively the handbook we've all been waiting for, and that is how to translate Russian literature. So that's what he wanted to bring out. He had his commission. It wasn't able to reach fruition. Magarshack's translations may have since been described by other translators such as Pevio and Volokhonsky as displaying a blandness, something tame which replaces the style, tone and humour of Dostoevsky's original. But Magarshack's renderings have also won acclaim from writers such as Kazuo Ishiguro, and after his death in 1977, Magarshack's death, there was a campaign to organise a commemorative blue plaque honouring Magarshack's services to Russian literature. Alas, that has still yet to arrive, but I hope that it will at some point. Ria also retired in 1964, and his retirement party was attended by 50 of his translators. Many people went, but 50 translators went, Magarshack included. With a change of editorship at Penguin Classics, there came a change of mission. And this was the pursuit of more scholarly translations to suit a more discerning reader, often those undergraduates trying to fast track their way through set reading lists. And there was a change of translation cohort. So Edmonds lasted until 1966. And then, in spite of her numerous requests to translate these lesser known texts by Tolstoy, she, like Fenn, was not employed again. Gilbert Gardiner disappeared into apparent obscurity, and a new cohort emerged with people like Ronald Wilkes, Richard Freeborn, Paul Foote, Michael Glennie, Joshua Cooper, all of whom had received military language training and were drilled in translation to such an extent that Magarshack, Edmonds and Fenn would probably have found it hard to compete with. So by way of conclusion, I'd actually like to finish by reiterating my view that this first cohort, Lane, Rieu, Gardiner, Fenn, Edmonds, Magarshack, all played a significant role, I think, in cementing the classic Russian literary canon in the modern Anglophone world of the 20th century. They initiated the interested general reader in great Russian literature. They normalized Russian names, places, realia, and culture at a time of political and cross-cultural uncertainty. And between them, they gave us these fabulous books. But more than that, they paved the way for the Soviet literature, which would soon follow, works by Gorky, then rapidly Solzhenitsyn, Bulgakov, Vainovich, Sholokhov, Vladimir, Tolstoy in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, requiring a whole new level of immersion by the Anglophone reader in Soviet politics, acronyms, stump compounds, prison camp jargon, yet more names, and unfamiliar locations extending beyond Moscow and St. Petersburg. So if you'd like to learn more about the translators I've focused on tonight and Penguin's next phase in translating Russian literature, you might like to look out for this. As it says on the tin, it's actually coming out on the 4th of January 2021. I'd like to thank you very much for sparing your Friday evening to tune in and listen. And I'd like to thank Pushkin House for hosting this event and the Anglo-Russian Research Network for organising the seminar series. I will be really interested and pleased to hear any comments and especially any shared nostalgia among any Zoomers here for the Penguin Russian classics. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you. I'll hand you back to Rafy.
Thank you, Cathy. Yeah, really fascinating presentation there. So thank you for that sort of potted history. That was.
You're welcome.
I had not really any knowledge at all about the history behind it, or Alan Lane, or at all. So that's really completely new to me. And what struck me at the very start, actually, is that Penguin books seem to be quite focused on the sort of not scholarly, largely working class, new reading public, and the prices of the books and the format and the language used. And does the start of that kind of market catering to non-professionals who have been, schooled in classics, who have had multilingual education, or who've gone to university, does that sort of market, it coincides slightly with the rise of Bolshevism, and do you think the Russophilia that Lane and Ria espoused and were trying to find a market for, was that slightly to do with this new idea of Russia as a great power?
Well, I think it was connected. It was quite interesting that Lane, clearly had this interest. He was quite amenable to them publishing Russian literature early on, but then, and he does actually acknowledge that it is an ideal. He wanted to go with that. He wanted to support. It's the only review that he sold the Transatlantic Review back over to America, but it's the one that I think he really felt quite passionate about. He wanted it to work, but then market forces just absolutely determined that it wasn't a runner. And that lasted all the way through till 1964, when he was then placed with the manuscripts for One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. And even then, they decided they couldn't see any literary merit in it. And Alan Lane actually said, I think it's going to be a dead duck. So I think even though he himself had left-leaning policies and he visited Moscow in 1957, I think he personally would have wanted to embrace it, but he had been forced to acknowledge that maybe the British public wasn't as interested as him. So yes, they tried to harness it, failed, and then suddenly realized when it came to Solzhenitsyn's other texts, actually, we really have to grab this. So that then really did warm up to the idea of what's going on in the Soviet Union.
So the kind of the more explicit Cold War period coincided with more of an interest.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We have a question from Jessica Vlasova, which is, why do you think Penguin chose two translators, Yelizaveta Fian and David Magarshack, for whom English was not a native language, to translate from Russian to English? And was a mistake at all?
That's a very good question. Well, I think they were pretty good at pitching themselves as founts of all knowledge, and I think they very much viewed themselves as gatekeepers. So Fen, I think, through her translations of Chekhov, if you read the introductions that she wrote, the introductions are very interesting in what they tell you about these translators themselves. Fen certainly held Chekhov up as the idyllic pre-revolutionary perfect author. And she sort of wanted, I think she might have been slightly in denial that there had been a revolution. She didn't like the revolution. And through her translations of Chekhov, she was going to recapture this beautiful image. And Magarshack wanted to assert himself. He'd got one foot in the British camp and one foot in the Soviet camp. He wanted to be regarded as the sort of expert in both places. He certainly was, he featured in Literaturная Gazeta and Komsomolskaya Pravda. So he did a good job of juggling both those sides. But Ria said that he didn't really know enough about Russian literature. He fully admitted that it was a mystery to him. So he willingly accepted the advice of others. He did a good job of building a network around him so that all languages were covered. I think he might have seen how William Heinemann suffered when Constance Garnett left. She was his Russian translator, and he made sure he had an array of Russian translators who were very good at switching from one language to the other. He had backup.
Yeah, very sensible. One thing I think is quite interesting is how the principle of equivalent effect works when you have somebody who has grown up in a Russian-speaking family or a culture and knows quite well what the real effect of the text is for a Russian. Often you get the kind of most interesting translations. Like, for example, with Nabokov's translations, you get some quite interesting choices. And yeah. I'm not sure exactly why it is, but I think you wouldn't ever get such kind of boldness from somebody like Constance Garnett.
No, and I mean, I ought to probably stress that the principle of equivalent effect is a problematic translation concept, because how could you possibly know what an ancient Greek audience experienced when they first had that original reading? So what I would say, though, is that, Magarshack was born in 1899, and he was not so far removed from the era he was trying to translate. So I would say it's okay. I'm all right with this concept for this particular era, but it is a bit problematical in some texts.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, well, I mean, we could have a whole discussion about what the real best way to translate anything is, and I think, in fact, we probably, if you're really interested in it, there's a podcast online where Robert Chandler talks about this on the Pushkin House website. So if you like, check that out afterwards.
Yeah, I think I've already seen that. Actually.
Right. Okay.
It's the sort of eternal question.
Yeah, I'm not going to try and weigh in on it at all.
And of course, it changes with each era. So that's what Penguin. It sort of came at a good era. The Constance Garnett served everybody so well. Then there's a slight lull, then it's Penguin's turn, and then the readership changes again. So I think it's the readership that maybe determines what the translators are required to do. So now it's sort of, they perhaps don't need to provide any footnotes because the internet will do that for you. So it's all there, if you're curious, you can find out.
That's something that kind of is quite interesting for me, because I always quite liked having the Russian names and patronymics and everything, and I thought it was a bit more of an insight into the culture of what that produced the work. So it slightly surprises me to hear that people don't like it, and that it was sort of ironed out in Magarshack's translations and things like this.
Very much so. They did get a lot of letters. I think I've just seen a question from Sarah Diligenti, is it? That's with the French translation. Influencer translation.
Yeah, could the fact that Rosemary Edmonds spoke fluent French have influenced her translation of Tolstoy, whom some Russian academics often criticized as writing Russian with a French accent, as he spoke French as a French native?
Yes, which is a really fascinating question. And hello, Sarah, thank you for the question. So yeah, I think it probably did help a lot. However, there are letters in the archive from readers. There's obviously a tipping point in Britain, certainly, around the 50s, where people are not so comfortable with languages. And whereas previously it would have just been the expected, it would have been the norm. You're going to read your text in the original, no translation at all. By the time we get to the 1950s, Penguin's starting to receive letters that say, actually, please, can you just give footnotes, or can you not bother including the French at all because I can't follow it. And so it must have broken Rosemary Edmonds' heart to hear people saying, I can't cope with your French, which she was probably very pleased to provide. But increasingly, it was a case of what do we do about these? It's an ongoing thing as well. We've had Tony Briggs' translation, which is different again. But yeah, these interspersions of French are very interesting.
And I suppose with translation, it's always an audience-facing art.
Yeah.
If it's an art or a craft, and I think something that comes through is that it does, the philosophy does change as the audience changes and as the conception of what the audience wants changes as well.
I suspect that's why they ended up changing the cohort, because there was a sense that Magarshack and Edmonds were quite dogged about what their reader was going to have. So time to change.
Yeah. We have a comment from Hugh Barnes, who thanks Cathy for the talk and says that Alan Lane's successor as editor-in-chief at Penguin was the late great Peter Carson, whose mother tongue was Russian, and who translated Chekhov's plays, Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, and Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich for Penguin Classics.
Well, I did not know that. So thank you, Hugh Barnes. Somebody asked for me to have a little rummage around it and see if there's something in the archive about. Thank you.
And Horatio asks whether you could say a little bit more about Alan Glover's role in developing the list.
Well, Alan Glover didn't, I would say he wasn't instrumental in selecting titles as such, but Alan Glover is somebody who I think is absolutely fabulous. And he was he really looked after his translators. He was a translator himself, but he was sort of the interface between Lane, junior members of staff, and the external translators who were commissioned. And he tried his damnedest to make sure that translators were paid, that they got their royalties when they were due. He was very polite in all the time, every letter. And he actually was at odds with Lane throughout. So Lane couldn't really get to grips with the fact that Glover was sort of self-taught. He was an autodidact who'd been in prison multiple times for his refusal to go to war. And he actually memorized the Encyclopedia Britannica in prison, the Wisdom's Almanac, Bradshaw's Railway Guide. He wrote the prison newspaper on toilet paper. He was covered in tattoos that had been acquired for religious reasons. He settled on Buddhism, so maybe Quakerism, I can't remember, but he basically tried to accommodate all translators' wishes, even though in one letter he says he's really trying to accommodate Mr. Magarshack, but he is so very needy, and that's him coming even as a Buddhist. But yes, he was very much in charge of checking the text, making sure it ran through the proofs okay and corrections. He liaised with translators across the world. So there was a request to translate David Magarshack's Crime and Punishment, not Dostoevsky's, David Magarshack's, into Hindi. And Glover pointed out that actually it probably ought to be Dostoevsky's translation, Dostoevsky's text that gets translated. So I think he was very good at the fine nuances of translation.
Well, yeah, in fact, talking of Magarshack, he strikes me as a slightly Dostoevskian figure himself, and his wife is a bit of an analog to Anna Dostoevskaya.
I think he'd love you to say that. I think Dostoevsky was his hero. I think he must have been devastated when the general British reading public did not associate him with Dostoevsky. Yeah.
Well, I think the thing about Dostoevsky is that I think he's less popular in Britain than Tolstoy, and I actually prefer Tolstoy to him as well. So
now the chat will go crazy with people. Tolstoy Dostoevsky debate.
Yeah, actually, I've started something now, haven't I?
Yes.
It's a really interesting one, which is a slight diversion, but also is a really great subject, and hopefully you'll have something to say about it, which is about the modernist design of the Penguin books. So John Allen, who is the chairman of the Isakon Gallery Trust and biographer of Bertolt Lubetkin, who was the Russian emigre architect who designed the Penguin Pool in '34 at London Zoo, where the penguins idea came from. He says that people might be interested to see the small exhibition on Allen Lane and Penguin books that was put on at the Isakon Gallery in Lawn Road, Hampstead, a couple of years ago. And the display panels are still on the gallery's website at isakongallery.org.
Oh, I would certainly be interested.
Yeah, and they've got something on Agatha Christie as well, who lived in the Isakon apartments.
Right, okay.
But there's something, I suppose, the modernist design and typography and sort of ethos is another kind of aspect of Penguin being a more future focused and sort of focused on the masses than others. Do you think that's sort of been an influential idea in publishing?
Well, I think so. I mean, certainly Allen Lane took his ideas from Albatross Books. So he saw the merit of having a logo, and I don't think that's gone away. I think people like having a recognizable logo. It's shorthand, isn't it, for your brand? And I think they have been influential. Yeah, getting your typescript right, getting your the font size, and these are very careful decisions that Penguin lost the illustrated classics. They completely had to, it was a total flop because they got all of the design wrong. The illustrations were too cramped, the paper was poor quality, and they very soon, after I think just 10 issues, 10 different copies, they had to ditch the whole idea. So yes, I think probably people have learned from Penguin's successes as well as their errors, what works and what doesn't. And I think, you can see the thread of that, as it comes out in different imprints today.
And a question from Yulia here, hello. Why were the 1950s the turning point in terms of the comfort with foreign languages? Do you have any idea on why that would have been the sort of...
I actually don't have an idea why. I'm sorry, Yulia, but I just can only assume that it was the start of phasing out language learning. Obviously, with text literature not all of a sudden appearing from the 1870 Forced Education Act, so there was a whole flurry of publishers who decided that actually they could corner a market by not publishing everything just in the original. So let's have it translated, and the elitism went out the window. So I guess it's a gradual watering down, but certainly letters from about the 50s onwards, there are people saying, I just don't want you to be putting it in French. That said, there were certainly letters in reply to that said our readers will think it's condescending if we don't include it in French. And if we put a footnote with it, that's also condescending. So it's sort of the tipping point.
Yeah, a bit of a minefield with that.
Yeah.
We have a question from Susan Reynolds who asks, does Fenn's autobiography, A Girl Grew Up in Russia, give us any information about her translating activities?
Oh, hello, Susan. I can't remember. I will have to have a little look. I think it does actually, and I think that's where she does not so much about her translation activities, but I think she reveals quite a lot about her self-perception as a gatekeeper. I really reject Bolshevism, and I reject what's happening in my country, and I'm going to channel my response to that through literature. So I think she does talk about that in there, but I can certainly have a look, and I'll send you an email, Susan.
Yes, actually, you mentioned Zoshenka at one point, and that they weren't willing to translate him. Why exactly do you think that was? Was he just not a big enough name? Or?
No, I think well, that's two people asked. Two people knew Zoshenka. One liked and one didn't like, and I wonder if it's sort of more to do with perception of quality of literature. I mean, they did bring out a parallel text of Zoshenka at Penguin in about 1968, but he doesn't actually appear properly until 2005 with the short stories. So he had a long wait to come out. And I think they basically just, at around the time it was first asked, they had everything in front of them. They had all of the Russian classics that they could run at. So why are we holding up with a lesser name, perhaps? So they clearly asked because they didn't know and they weren't familiar. But it wasn't deemed probably big enough to warrant. I mean, they even down to Ria asked Fenn whether she was familiar with Gogol's Dead Souls. So, and he acknowledged that Garnett had done a translation, and what did Fenn make of it? Is it worth us doing? Shall we retranslate? He really didn't know. So when you realise that he was coming from that position of knowledge, then it's probably no surprise it took a while to get Zoshenka out.
I think I actually first read him in that Penguin collection of short stories, actually.
Yeah.
So, question from Mavis Pilbeam here, a very interesting one, which was, what was Penguin Russian Classics competition? She's currently reading the Maud's translation of War and Peace from Macmillan in 1942. Macmillan series regarded in comparison, and were there any other sort of big early Russian publishers?
Well, Macmillan isn't really talked about in the archive very much, but other imprints were. And there was a real sense from, they talk quite openly to each other via longhand letter, Glover and Ria, about competing. And they actually say they've got to get ahead of Hamish Hamilton. That was one. And the other was Dent and Everyman, the Everyman Library. So I would say that in Penguin's eyes, they were regarded as the competitors at that stage, the early-ish stage. And then later, it becomes a bit like a frenzied piranha tank when it comes to Solzhenitsyn manuscripts. So there's Fontana, there's Collins, they're just competing with Farrar, Strauss-Giroux for all of the rights to the different Solzhenitsyn texts. So, and obviously prior to Penguin, there was some competition. There was the Heinemann, but also Vizitelli. So yes, there's some jockeying, and I think they probably spurred each other on to, we've got to get this one out next because they haven't done it yet. So there was very much a sense of that.
A couple of slightly more technical questions here. One from Helen, which is, you don't know any recommendations for Herzen's My Past and Thoughts translated. And another which asks when Isaac Babel was added to the list of penguins.
I'm hazy on both of those questions, I'm afraid. I don't know when Babel was added to the series, but he must have been later on because there's certainly there's nothing for Babel for right up the way through to the 70s because there's no file on him. And there's certainly not a file that I've found in the archive. And I've sifted all the way through, as I said, up to the 80s, the mid 80s. So I haven't been able to find that. That said, the archive is quite hard to navigate because you have things all over the place. It's a huge archive, so it could be that I've overlooked him, but if you go onto worldcat.org, then you'll be able to find that there. The Herzen, it's on the tip of my tongue, but if somebody wants to email me about that, so I'm more than happy to have a look around and see. And there may well be, I noticed names like Boris Strayuk is here, so he may well be able to add a little note in the chat. So
yes, yeah. In fact, Boris is a great translator of Babel himself.
Yes, exactly.
He has a question.
And he's quite right about the fact that Fen did get her translations of Zashinka out. She also she did manage to get her translations out with other publishers, but it was just this doggedness of Ria, who just kept sending her back, and he was quite adamant that she wasn't capturing the idiom that was penguin. He really felt that it was important to set the benchmark on that. So it would be interesting to compare how she got on with the other publishers, actually.
Let's see if there are any other questions at the moment. Well, there's one which asks something that we've touched on already, which is whether there is such a thing as an accurate translation, and if so, what could qualify as this?
That's such a fascinating question, and it's a never-ending question with multiple answers. But what I would say in terms of the penguin context is that they did strive for accuracy. They were, as they became more and more scholarly, I would say that their readers' reports become more stringent. It went down like a lead balloon when Magarshack got his first and only and last readers' report for his Chekhov's Lady with Lapdog, as he called it, because they put it out to a reader and it came back with pages and pages of queries. So when they look into it a little bit more, there's one thing getting sort of a sloppy text, is one thing getting a sort of a very personal style, but I think you probably draw a line when you start getting serious omissions. And certainly it caused a little bit of a stir at Penguin when it was pointed out that 2 essential lines in Crime and Punishment about Lazarus had been omitted by David Magarshack. And there was a sort of a flurry of letters trying to find out, because people were using them as set texts. They really, and some had older versions and newer versions, and there was a discrepancy. So that's when it becomes a little bit unacceptable. And I probably ought to put out in Magarshack's defense that his daughter told me was that they had a typist, and apparently the typist quite often just made up what she wanted to put in and not. So, so I think that must have been just heartbreaking to find out so late. He found out very late in his life that this had been the case, and it was a source of mortification. So you mustn't cast aspersions as to why these things have happened, but really that's where the checks and balances come in at the publishing house. So it's a fascinating question, the question of accuracy.
Yes, and in fact, that reminds me of another translator that you mentioned, Michael Glennie, whose Master and Margarita was the first. Well, in fact, I think it probably came out at the same time or even before the Russian version, and obviously didn't have a full Russian text, which was only, I think, in the 80s came out. So that obviously is a problem that can happen, I think, probably more often with the Soviet writers than the Russian ones. And do you know if there were any Penguin books that had sort of major revisions made to them because of more recent texts that came out?
Well, there was a big question mark over which was the authorized version of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, and there was a lot of dispute as to whether they'd got the best version at Penguin, but they went with it regardless. Certainly, with Michael Glennie, just to backtrack a little bit, his text was regarded as the full text, the complete text, but it was his sort of occasionally sort of less than accurate rendering of certain terms. He was quite free in some respects, but all credit goes to him for his speed at getting stuff turned around and his absolute passion. So he's somebody else who I have researched in the archives. And yes, his was the more complete version than the Mira Ginsburg one. So yes, you're right that the Soviet text, it must have been very difficult to piece together which is the full version. Is it this one or not this one? So it must have been a bit nerve-wracking for all the translators. What are they working with? But yes, certainly One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich was a text where they really weren't sure if they'd got the best version.
Mm-hmm. Just having a look. I don't see any more questions. Let me see if I can think of it. Oh, here we are.
See, I knew Boris would get this. Thank you, Boris.
He says that he believes the first appearance of Babel in any Penguin edition was The Story of My Dovecot in the 1969 Penguin Book of Modern European Short Stories, edited by Robert Taubman. And the translation was Walter Morrison's. And the collected stories appeared in 1994. So there's an answer there.
Okay, there must be a short stories folder hiding on shelf 312B. Thank you, Boris.
Where is the Penguin? You said it was at the Bristol, is that right?
It's at the University of Bristol Arts Library, yes. But they have materials there, but they also have it stored at Reading. And is it Reading? Might be Reading. I think it is. And they get stuff brought in as and when people need it as well. So it's a very nice way to connect with the translators, actually. You get to see their handwriting and, their spelling mistakes. They're quite normal human people. And, it's interesting that Magarshack occasionally misspelt the word literature.
Well, I mean, I'm sure he was working very quickly. And I think
he's got bills to pay.
Here's a great question. How were penguins viewed in the USSR, if at all? And were there any penguin bookshops there?
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, I don't think there were any penguin bookshops there, not as far as I know. But what is really interesting is that the reputation did spread at least as far as Solzhenitsyn, because there's a telegram from Solzhenitsyn, which I have in my book, where he really praises Penguin for their reputation, which has reached Russia, for making their books accessible. And he actually takes them to task. He says that what he'd really like them to do is to reduce all their prices of books, the Soviet prices, to match the Soviet levels, or to at least match employment, the salaries that people are getting. So he gives them a phone number and says, if you want to discuss, phone me. But they clearly didn't do that bit. But yes, other than that, I don't know what the view is. I know that people are familiar with Penguin, but I don't quite know how far back and what the view was back in. I don't know how I would be able to ascertain that, actually. But even when Magarshack, who kept his foot in the Soviet camp, when he liaises with newspapers, they never mention Penguin, they just mention Magarshack. Talentливый английский писатель is what he's called. So.
Well, I think Penguin had probably kept quite competitive on their pledge to make their books as cheap as a packet of cigarettes, at least in Britain. And I think in Russia, not so much, but
yeah.
So if there aren't any last minute questions, I'll give the audience a couple more seconds to ask any more. But yeah, I'll say thank you in advance to the audience for these questions.
You're welcome.
For coming to the talk. It's really great to have so much support, and it's I'd recommend next week's talk as well. Which will be about, who's it by? It is by...
Hall.
Yes, that's right. And he'll be talking about the British tourists to the USSR, the other side of the picture, Soviet city and countryside in 1930s Britain. So check that out next Friday if you're interested. And thank you very much, Cathy, for tonight's talk. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I'm really delighted.
It's a topic that I think connects a lot of us. A lot of our probably first or at least early interactions with Russian culture are through the Penguin Russian books. Oh, here we actually have somebody answering the question about whether they were in the USSR. No. The only shop where you could get English-speaking literature in Moscow was Progress Publishers.
Yeah.
And they do not actually exist anymore, but any local Dom Knigi will have probably English translations.
Mm-hmm. And of course, there were quite a few Brits who translated for Progress Publishers. So yes, they had their own scene going on, very much, probably in Soviet terms, the rival to Penguin. But yeah, it is nice. Oh, there we go. Michelle, hello, Michelle Birdie.
Right, brilliant. So the Progress were kind of competition to the British translators.
Yeah.
Well, that's I think a great way to round it off this evening. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Cathy, and to the ARRN, Anna and Mirren. So hopefully see you all next week.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rafy. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.